In June 1969, an uprising took place at the Stonewall Inn in New York City. As it was raided by the police in the early hours, 3 nights of unrest followed, with LGBT people, long frustrated by police brutality, finally fighting back. Lesbians and trans women of colour were some of the key people involved in the act of resistance. This anniversary is a reminder of the power of standing together in defiance of those who seek to divide us. A quote by Stonewall.
This Pride Month, we will be sharing with our Fluff community history, information, and methods of engaging with the Black Lives Matter movement. Without Black, Indigenous, and people of colour, the LGBTQIA+ community would not have the rights we have today, and we need to work together to create a safer world where no one is killed because of the colour of their skin. Hi, I'm Emma, she, her.
And I'm Jess, she, her.
And this is Fluff,
the podcast about friendship, love, unfortunate failure, and fun. Hi listeners.
Hey listeners.
Hi listeners, how you doing?
Yeah, checking in. How's everyone feeling?
Yeah, and I suppose we know that the majority of our listenership is white.
Yeah.
And so for our listeners who are BIPOC, which is Black, Indigenous, people of colour, our love to you for what has been a really emotionally and mentally brutal week. And understanding that everyone's recognising that this week is difficult, but what about everybody's whole experience throughout their life of being a BIPOC person?
Yeah.
And so we have reframed our episode plans for this week. There's no way that we can ignore the Black Lives Matter movement.
And it seemed inappropriate to talk about some sort of more flippant experiences, it was actually meant to be quite a comedic week, and it just seemed wrong.
Absolutely. And we're recording this on Wednesday.
Yeah.
Tuesday was the hashtag Blackout Tuesday. And Emma and I have been thinking about our work. We've been reframing our work. We've been supporting in ways that we can already.
Yeah.
And we're tired, aren't we?
Well, we've realised it feels like suddenly the white community has woken up, and we are people who are engaged in activism in all parts of our work generally, but suddenly we're having conversations with people from our lives who we've never had these conversations with in a direct way. And because we have a podcast, and we're artists, we do feel we have a responsibility to use our platform. So we've been doing a lot of brain work.
Yeah.
And it is hard work.
And I suppose I say we're tired as a recognition that imagine what it has been like for BIPOC people to fight this constantly.
Yeah.
I think we can understand our own fight as queer people and how exasperating that is. And I think, it's really hitting home even more, that feeling of constant exasperation. So we are going to keep going and do everything we can to support the movement.
Yeah. So welcome to our episode addressing our own white privilege and our own internalized racism. We have said that our podcast is about unfortunate failures, and this, we will say hands down, is the biggest failure for all white people, but we're going to be talking about our experience specifically today. So hold on tight, and if you're white, we encourage you to have the same reflection afterwards. And if you are BIPOC, you don't have to listen to this episode if it makes you uncomfortable. We don't want this to be an episode about white tears or performative activism. This is our first step, and we're hoping a learning opportunity for the white listenership.
Absolutely. And this is in response and content warning now that we're going to mention George Floyd. As we know, and I hope you know from the media, and the riots that are currently happening in the USA, and petitions and protests that are happening in the UK, that on May the 25th, 2020, George Floyd, a black man, was killed in Minneapolis Minnesota, when a white police officer, Derek Chauvin, kept his knee on the side of Floyd's neck for almost 9 minutes while Floyd was handcuffed face down on the ground. During those last 3 minutes, Floyd was motionless. There are 3 more officers who were involved in the arrest who further restricted George's body movement and prevented onlookers from intervening. Floyd suffered a cardiac arrest and was pronounced dead at a nearby hospital. Floyd was arrested because he was accused of using a counterfeit $20 bill at a market. And this has, I don't know whether it's right to say this has sparked it, but it's a catalyst, but it's also bringing up all the other murders that have happened for BIPOC people due to police brutality, due to complete inequality and white privilege.
Yeah. And I guess this has been an occasion where it has been filmed and shared on social media. I think it's Will Smith who said this is not the first time black people have been killed in police custody, but it is now being filmed. So this has been happening, obviously, for centuries.
Yeah.
And it seems that this has been broadcast quite widely and shocked people.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
So there's now been a worldwide response, I'd say.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
At least in Western cultures.
Yes. And that, I think Emma and I reflected, listeners, you may remember in London, in Camden, there was an attack on 2 well, actually there weren't even a couple, but 2 lesbian women on a date.
Yeah.
And they were attacked on a night bus on the way home from their night out in Camden. Camden is where Emma and I have lived in the borough of before. Yeah. Coming home on a night out, that is an experience that we have experienced so many times throughout our years in London. And when that attack happened on them, it was a homophobic attack. I remember the feelings when that happened of that could have so easily been me.
Yeah. And
I suppose what we have realised or clicked is that is an experience of a black person to feel every day, and seeing George Floyd is like, that could have so easily been me. And to live with that constantly is absolutely horrific and completely unacceptable. And Emma and I both experienced, after the attack on these 2 lesbians, suddenly family and friends were reaching out and being like, oh my gosh, that could have so easily been you. Are you okay?
The world, yeah.
Exactly, that outrage for it. And that was that one incident on us. And we had an annoyance where we were like, but why now?
Yeah, it's always been this way. Why do you suddenly... It was like suddenly all of our straight friends and family had realised that we do have an identity that can sometimes put us in danger. So that it feels like that's what the white world is doing right now.
Exactly. Whereas we're here to acknowledge our white privilege, that sense of danger, that reality of danger is what BIPOC people experience daily.
Yeah.
And have experienced since colonialism, the beginning of time, which we'll go into.
Yeah, we've got lots of definitions and lots of teaching today from our own learning, because we have engaged in the topics. We've both studied it before, but we are coming back to it and we want to share today. But you might have heard at the beginning of the episode, we've also changed the format of our celebration of Pride Month this year, because it is Pride Month. Hello, welcome everyone. Welcome to Pride Month. But Pride started as a riot. Pride started as a protest, and it was spearheaded by black and ethnic minority trans women, in particular at the Stonewall riots. And so for this month, we were going to be platforming people of different racial backgrounds to use our platform, but also we're going to be sharing a little bit more history about people. So instead of what are we drinking, we're going to be talking about who are we toasting to, who are we drinking for today.
Exactly. So you can raise your cup of tea, you can raise your glass of water, you can raise whatever your tipple is. And today we are going to talk about Marsha P. Johnson, who we are toasting to today. Now, Marsha P. Johnson, Marsha was a transgender activist at the forefront of pivotal moments in history. And she played a large role in the Stonewall riots and co-founded the Street Transgender Action Revolutionaries, which is the acronym of STAR, along with Sylvia Rivera. Marsha P. Johnson died in 1992 at the age of 46 when her body was found in the Hudson River. The circumstances around her death are still being examined to this date, but her activist lives on through her legacy. Here are 5 things to know about Marsha P. Johnson. And this is what a lot of the queer community are saying today, especially with Pride Month.
Yeah.
Like, we're all covering ourselves in glitter celebrating.
Yeah.
But for white queers, for white LGBTQIA plus people, we would not have Pride Month without trans women of colour, without people of colour.
Yeah.
So,
and it's a different fight for them because they have a different amount of oppression on them.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So, Marsha P. Johnson, as I said, was the founder, along with Sylvia Rivera, of STAR, which is an organisation providing shelter to homeless queer youth. Marsha P. Johnson played an important role in the Stonewall riots, which is why we have Pride today. Pride, all of the prides that you go to all across the world are because of this.
Yeah. So, a protest and a riot, which is what's happening in America right now. But we celebrate Pride as if it's this commercial party. But actually, we need to remember it came out of fighting back.
Yeah, exactly. And fighting back, Johnson was at the front line. And many do believe that she was the first to start the Stonewall riots. Another thing to know about Marsha P. Johnson, she toured America and Europe as a member of avant-drag performance troupe called Hot Peaches.
Cool.
Excellent name. Love that name. So Marsha P. Johnson was photoed out and about town with the likes of Andy Warhol.
Ah.
Yeah. And Johnson is remembered as an incredibly loving and fun person. Our house would be full of people dancing was a quote by Johnson here. Johnson also co-founded the Gay Liberation Front.
Wow.
And I actually went to some Gay Liberation Front meetings last year in London to kind of reboost the work and talk about what we're doing. I by no means was active in that. I went and kind of sat and observed, offered some things, but the Gay Liberation Front advocated for the sexual liberation of all people. The group was immediately formed after the Stonewall riots, with its first act being to maintain the momentum of the uprising. How key is that? This is where we're at now. It's, as we say, everyone's saying, if you posted a black square yesterday to show your solidarity for the Black Lives Matter movement, it's about how do we keep it going? Don't let it go.
Yeah. Make sure you do something today and tomorrow and the next day, whether that's educating or sharing. We'll talk about that more later.
Exactly. And then finally, just to let you know that there is a documentary on Netflix about Marsha P. Johnson. So the death and life of Marsha P. Johnson, because about they call it the peculiar circumstances around Johnson's death, as she was reported missing, and it was 6 days after that her body was found in the Hudson River. Police ruled it suicide, but friends and family disagree. There was slowness among the police department to investigate Johnson's death. But in 2012, it was reopened. And that is where the Netflix documentary takes a closer look at it. So we are toasting to Marsha P. Johnson, for who myself and Emma, two white queer people, we...
oh, so much to
Marsha P. Johnson.
Marsha. Tasty bit of Pimm's though.
Okay, we are drinking Pimm's. We are drinking Pimm's. It was left over from a birthday celebration at the weekend.
Yeah.
So Emma and I will be talking about, with our lovely listeners today, thank you for being here. We're going to talk about the history of colonialism, which is the key and foundation for all white people to understand what this conversation is about at the moment.
Yeah.
We're then going to talk about white privilege.
Yeah.
Even if you know what these are, I think it's so important that we just keep talking about it, remembering.
Yeah.
I think it's really important that the more we talk about it, the more we get on top of the dialogue, so that we can then say it to other people. Like, we need to practice our dialogue and take it into us so we know how to frame it well.
And hearing how different people phrase it is always useful as well, regardless if it's something you talk about every day or not. I think there's always different ways of looking at things, because at the end of the day, the way we bring this down is through voting and action, but also through communication. So we need to know how to talk the talk.
It's like, I saw a post yesterday by a black artist who was saying, whilst I understand that you're all turning to literature now that will educate you on colonialism, on oppression, like, remember to then also read fiction books just to engage with everything that black authors have written, for example. But I also need to make sure my mission on myself at the moment is to read all the recommended books, because I know I need a much better understanding.
Yeah.
So that is my core first work, and then absolutely also making sure that to just celebrate and engage with all work by BIPOC people.
And my new mission, which is brutal, because I feel like it took this week, even for us to wake up. I am studying sociology at the moment. I have done a lot of academic reading around race, so I do feel I know the fight. I know what I need to say to people, but I've always left that in my realm of academia. Not that I have let people say racist things around me, but I haven't engaged in conversation with my family, for example, on this topic. And yesterday sent round loads of messages to people saying, hey, do you want to talk about this? So I guess this is our step one for how we start conversations.
Exactly. And so we're going to address our own white privilege first. So as we always do our anecdotes, we're going to tap upon how we are white privileged and our history of that. So I grew up in an entirely white community, an entirely white society. But then, upon leaving what I thought was my entirely white community, entirely white society, I can't say just that community was, because the whole world is. And that is when, and it was not until, ashamed to say, and you should be ashamed, my third year of university, I wish in year one there was an opportunity to take the module called post-colonialism. That module should be key. Everybody should take that in the first term.
It should be a priority.
It should be a priority.
Yeah.
And then I remember conversations around, we're going to make gender and sexuality a core thing that everyone has to take. Yes, actually, first and foremost, post-colonialism. Because how can we understand how the world works without doing this?
Exactly. And that has its own implications on race and gender. You have to start with the history of where we've come from, where all of our systems come from, if you want to understand where we need to go.
Yeah, to understand the world that we live in.
Yeah.
And we don't understand the world that we live in as white people, which is the thing. Whereas BIPOC people do understand the world that we live in.
Yeah.
So this is why we need to do the action now. And I think growing up, and then I grew up in Kent, a very white Tory area. And when I had lived in London and I understood racism more, I understood systemic racism, which we'll talk about, but basically how it's embedded in all of society. When I used to go back to Kent, I used to be confronted with what I would call, a few years ago, it's casually racist. Or I heard friends, I heard family say casually racist things. And then I learned that there's no such thing as casual racism, because casual racism is racism.
Yeah.
But I used to come back to London and moan and groan to my friends about, you won't believe what I heard somebody say this weekend, like these things amongst Kent. But had I stood up and said anything at the time? No.
Yeah. I too grew up in a really, really white area, really white life experience. I don't remember coming across many racist comments, at least, but I think the absence of diversity speaks volumes. My best friend in early childhood was a mixed race girl, and looking back, I remember we would talk about, her hair being different, and we talk about her being different with her. We never talked about me being different, because I wasn't.
Right.
And I don't remember anyone ever speaking to me about race. I remember the first time my Muslim friend started at our school, and he was at the bus stop on first day, and I said to my mum, what's that thing on his head? And I just remember her saying, don't ask that, but not addressing it. And so I feel like, and I'm one of my best friends at school was Chinese, but we never discussed that. That was just, I'm sure that they all felt incredibly different, and I never knew that was a thing. And I don't think anyone ever spoke to us about that. Definitely not in school, but not my parents either, who are, liberal people. My mum is very engaged in the movement now, but I wonder what difference could have been made if we'd known to have these conversations back then.
Yeah. And we might have, as you say, noticed that difference. And again, the difference is the white person is the status quo. The white person is the foundation, the baseline. That's how the world has presented itself.
Yeah.
I remember I didn't go to university until 23, but I went to go and visit friends who'd gone to university at 18. And I remember particularly being in the canteen of one of my friends' universities, and I looked around and I said, why does everyone eat within their own racial divide. I was like, why is it divided into races around this canteen? And they're like, oh, well, it is. But, and of course they didn't agree with it. But I just remember then seeing that and going into university, going into higher education. Again, I just wish I had more education to take me into university, because I think, so we went to drama school, and I think that was just too late that my education started. I'm glad that it's starting now. But for BIPOC students within a university setting, within a drama school setting, I think I started to learn about why my classmates did not feel comfortable in certain class situations, did not feel comfortable in rehearsals for shows that they couldn't see themselves in.
Yeah.
We did not study acting, which is a whole different kettle of fish.
Can of worms, I was going to say. Yeah.
But I remember in my first year doing a play about World War II. It was set in Kent. It was about women in the war effort. And I remember we were not a full white cast. And I remember that Black and ethnic minority students within that company were trying to provide ways to have their voices heard. And that becomes also the education that I didn't know, where I hadn't been taught about how people have been stolen from other countries to fight in the British World War. Like, you fight in the name of Britain. We might then, liberate your country from our empire, from our colonialism.
Yeah.
And they taught me about that. And also, I did not acknowledge it enough. I did not.
Well, you didn't get it at the time.
I didn't get it, no. Yeah. And it wasn't until yesterday, Emma, that I read a really particular page in some books about the world wars, and I was like, oh shit, I get it now. People were really stolen from their countries to fight on behalf of Britain, and that is why they should have been represented in our play about the world wars.
Exactly.
White privilege.
I did go to an acting course, a full acting course, before I went to the drama school where I met you, and there were 3 Black people of 36, I think, that graduated, and they all did quite well on the course, I guess. They got some interesting roles. It wasn't like they played the maids or the servants all the time, but
by the way, just to say, the reason we're not saying that as a flippant thing,
no,
but in our third year we went to see a show where the Black students did play the maid and servants, and I
don't think I ever saw a show that was set in any historical context where the Black students weren't playing maids and servants.
And I remember Emma and we went to one of our lecturers and we said, we've just seen this play and this is not okay.
Yeah.
And there was a bit of discussion, but there wasn't enough around it.
Yeah, and I don't think we pushed hard enough.
We didn't push hard enough.
We just did the once and nothing happened.
Yeah, we had a conversation and that was it.
Yeah. But I do remember their casting while I was at this institution was always, I don't know, there was always a discomfort around talking about the fact that they were of a different race. And I do remember one of them in particular was English as an additional language, and he was often mocked and made fun of for not understanding the context. And I feel I laughed and I didn't understand, and there's no excuse for it. And I remember having in our final term, so an agency came in and talked to us about what all of our hits would be when you're out in the world, meaning like what type of role you'll get.
Right.
And the roles that they suggested for the Black students were, of course, things like, oh, well, you'll be really great street kind of character. You'll get this kind of thing. When actually one of them was incredibly proficient in Shakespeare. I mean, it was just a complete... But at the time, I was like, oh, and what's my hit? And it was all very structured and fitting into the systems.
So curriculums, the modules you take are not inclusive of BIPOC students.
Not at all.
Like across, and access to education. Like there's just so much, which is why we are privileged as white people.
I guess my main learning around race happened when I encountered one of the most amazing women in the world, in our collective world, Karen, who I feel like was a major life mentor for me, helped me decide what I want to do next. But she's a beautiful Jamaican woman who's a director and makes incredible work, and I was in 2 shows that she directed while at Central. One which sort of became quite problematic because it was a cast of all white people who clashed with her way of thinking. And then the second one was about a story about 2 black girls, but we were again an entirely white cast.
Yeah.
Apart from 1 mixed race girl and 1 Asian girl. And I remember even then, after having had that education from Karen, which opened my eyes, I wrote an essay at the end of that saying the show was too much about race, we didn't engage in their sexuality. And I wrote that essay genuinely believing it, because the girls in question there was a lot of speculation around their sexuality. I don't know if you remember that part. You were in that show.
Yeah,
you remember that? And I was thinking, oh, we never really had those conversations, and I was coming out at the time, so I was going through that experience and was like, this is the thing, this is the main oppression. And even at that point, writing an academic essay after having done an entire unit that was engaging in race, I was putting one oppression over another.
Yeah.
Silencing the black fight, because I felt like that had been too blatant.
And it's in drama schools, any drama schools, if you're only going to accept a majority white student cohort, then how, but people want to tell the stories which are not just white. Like, you need to accept a much wider diversity, because how can we tell the stories of BIPOC people if we don't have BIPOC people to represent them?
But also as lecturers, Karen was the only black lecturer that we had, and she was a visiting lecturer on temporary contracts. And that is the same in universities across this country. Most of the BIPOC female lecturers in particular are on non-permanent fixed-term contracts.
And then what happens? The very few black students, very few black staff become the ones fronting this battle. So this links back to now. Too late. It's too late. But don't then just go back into our shell. You have to stand up now.
Yeah. And one of my lecturers at Goldsmiths has written this amazing book called Space Invaders, which is about the process of what happens when you're what happens to people who are outsiders in a space and the processes they go through. And one of the things she talks about is you have the burden of representation, where one person suddenly feels they have to carry the representation of their entire community and fight for those rights at all times. So black students in our university or black lecturers suddenly are carrying the burden of all black people to fight for everyone, which is so unfair.
And I think, Emma, it's that thing that as much as we are angered by racism, we are angered by racial inequality.
Yeah.
But I suppose being, or like, our main thing has always been queerness. Like, that's the thing that we're constantly like, grah, about. But why, as white people, can we not be constantly grah about racial inequality and white supremacy? Like, and I think this is, like, for us people who are engaged in it, but not to the level where it's our constant, I would say. I'm going to, because, so now is like, oh, it should constantly be tiring us. It is. And honest, that is your choice. Either you choose a life of being constantly tired by activism, and I hope on my deathbed I am tired.
Yeah. I come back to something I said in the coming out episode, where someone once said to me, and you've had it said to you, everything you do doesn't have to be political. Imagine saying that to a black person or an indigenous person. Yeah. Everything they do is political because they're just trying to live their life.
Yeah, exactly. And it is tiring because this is the world that we live in.
Yeah.
So
wouldn't it be amazing if when we lived our lives it wasn't political?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, we could all be like a little bit more clear-headed.
Yeah.
We could sleep a bit easier, but we can't. And I think we've not been able to sleep for our own experiences, but we have so much privilege. So much privilege.
I feel like the definition of white privilege, because I have come from a very well-to-do family who were able to make their money through, self-improvement over the last 50 years. I've had multiple degrees now, which my parents have paid for. I have been able to pay international tuition. I've moved across the world. I've done everything just because so much of that is coming from the privileged background that I've come from. I didn't need to work jobs while I was studying. I didn't need to the first time. I was able to do what I wanted and pursue a passion career.
Yeah. And then going into economy, about when we graduated and were getting work. So I suppose that looking at employment we all came out of our degree going into community theatre, so work that was working with the community through arts. But the majority of our course were white, but we all had the same degree. We'd all studied the same things. But I think if you look within our field, it's highly white. Incredibly white. And I think I first had my experience of this. I started to learn this phrase, become aware of taking space is the word used. For example, I worked in East London with a theatre company, and we were working in trying to support young children who are at risk of gang affiliation. And I was particularly working with young girls, and all of my participants were black, and I was the white teacher, the white facilitator. And I just felt that I'd taken this job, I'd become this teacher for them, this drama teacher for them, whereas I was not the role model that they needed, or I did not have the life experience with which they could connect to. And I was so aware of it, and I was like, this job should not have gone to me. And I'm also a person who needs money, needs to pay rent, but I did leave that job in the end because I was just like, I'm just saying, like, I was just so aware that I should not have ever been employed as a white person in that position, because there was somebody so much more relatable for the young people to the job. It should have gone to a black person. It should have gone to a black woman.
I have a really horrible story that made me uncomfortable when it happened, but I didn't say anything and I did it anyways. I worked for a company in the last couple of years where we are constantly applying for funding for projects, whether or not we planned the project in the first place, because that's the reality of living in an arts organization. We don't get enough funding. So I was sent a fund from my boss, which was to apply to, and it's really horrible. This is a really horrible story. Apply to the Stephen Lawrence Foundation about how we're going to build community in celebration of Stephen Lawrence Day. And we made an application to do... we'll explain who Stephen Lawrence is in a bit.
I'll give a really quick quick definition just so you can follow the story. Stephen Lawrence was a young person who in 1993 was racially murdered in London by white youths. Murdered in 1993, and it wasn't until 2012 that 2 men were arrested for his murder.
It's brutal, and there is an amazing charity that has come from the Stephen Lawrence Foundation, has come from that, and they engage in activity across the UK that is anything to do with supporting black and ethnic minority youth. And so we applied to do a project with the Islam Community Centre here, and we got the funding. And it was meant to be with the local primary school as well, but the local primary school to them didn't engage with it because we wanted it to be a mixed scenario. I was trying desperately to find a non-white practitioner to run this project, and no names came up and there was no availability. So I found myself in a position with funding from the Stephen Lawrence Foundation, running a workshop with all non-white young people about diversity and the importance of diversity, which just was brutal and made me cringe. And they were really lovely, and the people at the center were like, come back, do it again, we liked it so much. But the whole time was thinking, this should not be me. I don't need to tell these young people that they are valued. I don't need to tell them that we need to have a more accepting community. They know that. They know that better than I do. They should be giving it to me.
Living it, yeah.
So I was creative and made it, I suppose I made it more about community and what's important to community for you. But that is a situation where I feel, not that I had anyone who was able to take the work, but I feel that should have been someone else. And that kind of occasion has come up many times in applying for jobs in applied theatre. Sometimes I find applied theatre quite problematic because a lot of the work involves helping the other, which may or may not want your help, but we have the money, so we come in and say, oh, let's run this project with this community.
Yeah.
And there's a really interesting quote. I actually just wrote an essay on this. There's a really interesting quote that is your empathy about genuine empathy, or is it about this cannibalization of the other to make yourself feel good in a position of authority, to make yourself feel like you've done something?
Yeah. Which again goes back to Blackout Tuesday.
Yes.
And there was a real frenzy. I remember waking up and there was
I literally didn't say good morning to you. I said, can I post a black square on Folx?
Yeah. But then the thing is then you're then reflecting on, I then started to hear black friends' responses to it. Many black friends said, this is really offensive.
Yeah.
Do not be silent. This is not time for white people to be silent. And we kept active throughout the day, and then we're doing things throughout the day, but it was, I can understand what it was then like to see a stream of black squares which were not intended to be, it was about not posting anything about your personal self on that one, not white people having the voice about their white experience.
And it was the problem of
active for BIPOC people.
Yeah, and the problem was in hashtagging Black Lives Matter, all of the important information was just hidden with a bunch of black squares, so it was an unintentional silencing of the community. So you might have seen that actually we changed hashtags to Blackout Tuesday. On Fluff we said please don't tag Black Lives Matter. I did see some posts from black and mixed race friends who said the opposite side, saying if you don't post a square, I'm deleting you.
Yeah.
So there was the two sides. It was a very sort of difficult day, but there was definitely in the morning, I felt like everyone woke up and as white people thought, oh shit, I need to post something.
Yeah, definitely. Absolutely, definitely. Yeah. I actually did post my square straight away. I did delete my square. Now I'm like, oh, maybe I should have archived it. Which is the stupid things, the questions you're having. Just because some of my close friends were posting their outrage at white people. And so then I changed it for something else. Something that I felt was a bit more, was showing my active.
Yeah.
But I suppose the main thing is just take time. Like the whole idea was for white people to think about, like reflect and think about what they're going to do now.
And if you did post a square and you did tag Black Lives Matter, acknowledge that and keep working. Like we didn't get it right the first time, and that's fine. I saw something today that was like, if you sit down at the piano for the first time and you play something and you're not very good, you don't just never do it again. You practice and you get better, and that's how we should be acknowledging allyship. Yeah,
absolutely. And that comes back to if as a white person, a BIPOC person ever says to you that calls you up on something on your activism, listen to the black experience and reframe. So
I think maybe this is a good point to officially define white privilege.
Absolutely. So I'm going to talk about white privilege, define it by also referring mostly to the book that I'm reading at the moment, which is incredible. It's by Rennie Edo-Lodge. It's called Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. I'm flying through the book. I'm so engaged, captivated. Cannot believe I do not know a lot of this stuff.
Yeah, it's a great read.
It's a great read. And Emma and I have been doing a lunchtime reading on Zoom call with some white friends. So I'm going to refer to that just because I can't not, because it just sums it up. White privilege is an unearned power, an unearned status, unearned opportunities. We are just, as white people, born with so much more available in opportunity wise, but also just in terms of how we exist, how the looks that we get, the understanding from other people that we get, and these are what Black, Indigenous, and people of colour do not have. So Rennie Edo-Lodge says that you don't know that you have privilege because you don't know what it is to live without it. So if you are a black person with the absence of white privilege, you know. We don't know. We won't be aware as white people until you realise and learn.
I think she says you won't get looks in the street. You won't think, oh, did I not get that job because of my race? You won't experience comments, or you won't be part of. She talks about like how we define what's a good school. How do you define what's a good school? Is it a good neighborhood? Does a good neighborhood mean a white neighborhood?
Yeah.
And so as a white person, you won't ever encounter it as privilege because you've never experienced not having it.
Exactly. And I'm just going to read some quotes because, I mean, this is brilliantly just put. So Rennie says, white privilege is a manipulative, suffocating blanket of power that envelops everything we know like a snowy day. It's brutal and oppressive, bullying you into not speaking up for fear of losing your loved ones, or job, or flat. It scares you into silencing yourself. You don't get the privilege of speaking honestly about your feelings without extensively assessing the consequences. I've spent a lot of time biting my tongue so hard it might fall off. There it is. So it's that idea that imagine a black person sitting in a room and being like, just like, I suppose, such noise around them of like white privilege buzzing about them. But then also not addressing it for fear of losing things, but also the white people not addressing things for fear of losing things. If I had addressed with racist comments that have happened in my family, but if I was just like, I just don't want an argument with them, like we've come through so much, we're not arguing anymore. But that's what it is. It's like just not saying about it.
I think it's important to acknowledge that this is where people are like, oh, but I've had a hard life. White privilege does not mean that you have not had trauma or you've not had difficult experiences. It just means that you have not experienced that because of your race.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. Whereas, which then comes into reverse racism.
Yeah.
So this goes back to Stephen Lawrence, who we mentioned earlier. So in Renee's chapter on white privilege, in the book, I'm no longer talking to white people about race, the backlash from 1993, when Stephen Lawrence was racially murdered, what happened in 2012 after the two people were sent for life imprisonment, the two white people who had murdered Stephen Lawrence.
Yeah.
What happened? The conversation did not then go into the racist society, systemic racism, what we can do to change this. It then became about reverse racism. So reverse racism is when white people will say, oh, you're being racist to me, because the whole thing was about how can we stop white people murdering black people or hurting. Like, how can we stop racism?
And you know what? Reverse racism doesn't exist.
Doesn't exist.
It's a fake
It's not a thing.
In the book, she really beautifully says that there is prejudice. So a black person can have prejudice towards a white person, but they don't have enough power to actively impose reverse racism on them.
Yeah. And then the focus of the media was then stolen completely.
Yeah.
To be about white...
Not all white people.
Yeah, not all white people are racist, da-da-da. Whereas what Renee says, and this is so poignant because this is exactly applicable to this week and now. So Renee says, we could have asked ourselves honestly, as a country, if taking 2 decades to convict just 2 of the gang who murdered an innocent teenager was acceptable. We could have asked ourselves if we were ashamed of that. Maybe we could have spoken about the fact that racism has only been a political priority for less than half a century. We could have had a conversation about riots and race, about accountability, about how to move forward from Britain's most famous race case. We could have had a conversation about how to start eliminating racism. We could have started asking each other about the best way to heal. It could have been pivotal. Instead, the conversation we had was about racism against white people. Yeah. So this is absolutely... In fact, I'm going to put this on my story later. I'm going to be like, this is literally what it is for today.
Yeah.
The fact that...
White people hijacked such an important conversation to make it about themselves.
Exactly. And this is just saying, let's not let this ever happen again. Like, now let's use this surge that is happening, white people waking up to the racist societies that we live in, and do what we can to support the Black Lives Matter movement and to help make a more equal society. Just I mean, it takes... The thing is, and this is from studying sociology, it's going to take
a revolution of sorts. That doesn't mean it has to be like death and war, but it means we need to completely dismantle the system that we currently use in order for racism to be abolished. Yeah. And that's the same with sexism, and the same with all the other isms exist because of what we use, our structures for how life exists in the Western world. And so we do need things to be big. The riots at the moment are a big response, and they need to be big. It needs to be bigger than that.
Yeah, exactly. And white privilege then is present in every action, in every movement that we do in our daily lives through society. I know lots of people saying like it's just how you walk down the street, it's how I drive in a car, it's how I might engage with a police officer, it's everything. It's how your teacher treats you, it's how a shopkeeper treats you. It's just so present. I remember reading something the other day, and a girl was saying, I just walked down the street and somebody stopped me and asked me if I had a number for drugs. Like, it's just such stereotypes embedded into society that a person is just walking down the street, just being herself. And then the impact of that, like just being so brutally stereotyped, is horrific.
Can I talk to you about colonialism?
Colonialism is the foundation of
all evil.
Yeah, exactly. And it is the key education.
It is the foundation of all evil, but also the foundation of the Western world. Everything we do in the UK, in Canada, in America, in most of Europe is based on colonial systems. So this is where we need to acknowledge our history. So I have a definition here, which I think is quite helpful, from National Geographic, actually. Colonialism is defined as control by one power over a dependent area or people. It occurs when one nation subjugates another, conquering its population and exploiting it, often while forcing its own language and cultural values upon its people. By 1914, a large majority of the world's nations had been colonized by Europeans at some point. The concept of colonialism is closely linked to that of imperialism, which is the policy or ethos of using power and influence to control another nation or people that underlies colonialism. So colonialism is the sort of act of actually colonizing, owning another country, but imperialism is the power that runs underneath it. So colonialism has practiced for a long time. Ancient Greece, ancient Rome, ancient Egypt all took over, whatever that means, other countries. But where it becomes quite problematic is in more recent times, I guess you might say. Modern colonialism began during what's known as the Age of Discovery, which I find a problematic term in and of itself, because this was Europeans discovering places where people already lived and had established ways of living. And so they discovered because they thought that they had all the knowledge. They had more knowledge. They had a way of living that they wanted to impose on other people. And it began in the 15th century. So this was most European countries were involved in this. But the problems with colonialism is the impacts include, to this day, environmental degradation, the spread of disease, economic instability, ethnic rivalries, and human rights violations. Yeah. So colonialism is where slavery comes from. Colonialism is where the issues around Indigenous people in the Americas come from. Colonialism is how the UK has more power than the rest of Europe, because at one point they controlled most of the world. It's a absolutely brutal thing, which is what established both the UK and America in many ways, because it was colonizers that set up America who brought those ideas to them. Likewise, Canada. And that is where I talked about this before in the concept of homo nationalism, where the colonizers have went and set up their way of thinking, tried to change people, tried to make them fit into their Christian cultures generally. and set up laws, and then either it's become problematic in more recent years because they've abandoned those countries who now don't know how to function on their own or haven't been able to establish their own order, or they
took all the money back as well. They took everything back. They just took all the structures, just left, and then suddenly that country then becomes a third world country. Exactly. So it was the number of people enslaved as well.
Yes.
11 million.
So every single country that was set up through colonization engaged in the slave trade in some capacity.
Yeah. To build that society. So the raw reality of it is that people were trading, as Rennie puts it in her book, actually, in human flesh.
Yeah.
So these were people stolen from their countries because the British Empire thought that they were the best and stole people.
Yeah.
And took them to where they wanted in the world and made them do forced labour.
And what's difficult about this now is that I don't remember ever learning the word colonialism in school, even though we learn about explorers, and I did that in air quotes, who are exploring the world and making discoveries. We learn about Christopher Columbus, the dickhead, who is so problematic. They're all problematic in how have they engaged with the native people that they encountered and or brought slaves with them. And it's something where it's quite clear that we now feel like we're in this time of post-racism, but actually the structures that we are still feeling the ongoing effects of colonialism. For example, we were talking just today about when the slave trade was abolished, the white slave owners were given reparations, so paid money because of their loss of business, instead of putting that money into the black people who had been enslaved, which is outrageous. And that apparently lasted until 2015, that they were getting money back in their taxes. So people are still benefiting off of the slave trade.
So still to this day, white rich people, their ancestors may have been, their ancestors may have been people who had enslaved people and earned money off of it.
And they're still rich because of that.
People are still rich today because of slavery.
On the other side, black communities were set up as ghettos, as outside of the white community, because there was segregation. I know in Canada, there was lots of slaves from the States who fled to Canada. So we always, in school, you're always taught Canada is so good. But those communities were not integrated into the white community, were not given financial support. And so that systemic difference in income, the economic impact, has such a long-lasting thing. And it all comes back to stupid colonialism.
And then it didn't stop there, because then in the World Wars, the British were again recruiting humans from other countries, from people that they had colonized, to come and fight in their world wars, sometimes promising them things at the end, such as from India, or like, we promise we will stop our empire and you can have India back, you can become independent. But they didn't. And so people were stolen and made to fight in the World War, given the worst jobs. They were digging the trenches. And this is the things, again, we're not taught. Like, people were brought out, like, even just travelling on a ship to come over and fight in Britain's World War, like, for what? Britain's king from the country of Britain? Like,
and how outrageous is that when Remembrance Day and learning about both world wars is part of the curriculum every year in primary and secondary school in this country, and I doubt that that's ever been engaged with. Yeah.
Which is why we find celebrating any kind of victory days, or we don't celebrate victory days, because it shouldn't be framed in that way. We should be talking about what really happened during those world wars.
Not to mention the idea of celebrating any sort of victory when people lost their lives is outrageous. So I guess what I want to say, because a lot of the things that I've been seeing have been, isn't it so bad in the States? And I guess we've both been seeing things like, actually it's bad, it's horrific in the UK as well, which I think is, there's loads of cases of young people, of black people being killed here as well by police. And because I'm Canadian, and I know we have some Canadian listeners, I also want to address this in Canada, because I feel like Canada has this reputation of being this like multicultural safe space. We do have a lot of diversity. Toronto, at one point in the last decade, was rated most multicultural city in North America because it's most integrated. But that doesn't mean that we are free of systemic racism. We are, yes, better than the States, but the States, I said this to you earlier, the States are like hell. So we don't want to be just better than that. There's still so much work to do.
I don't think we can ever use the phrase, but we're better than.
Exactly.
Because that there still is showing that
there's work to do.
Yeah, exactly.
There is work to do. So in a UN report by the Human Rights Council, there was a report in 2017 about things that Canada needs to address for African Canadians. And there's just one part that I want to read to you, which I think addresses this. Despite Canada's reputation for promoting multiculturalism and diversity and the positive measures taken to address racial discrimination, the working group is deeply concerned about the human rights situation of African Canadians. Canada's history of enslavement, racial segregation, and marginalization has had a deleterious, basically deleting. I don't know how to pronounce it. Deleterious impact on African descent, which must be addressed in partnership with communities. Across the country, many people of African descent continue to live in poverty and poor health, have low education attainment, and are represented in the criminal justice system. So because I think we're taught in school about the Underground Railroad and how slaves escaped America and came to Canada, I don't think Canadians even know that we had slaves.
Right.
Or enslaved people.
Yeah, and just to say that enslaved people, that is a more inclusive, a more respectful term to say.
Because slave would be an identity, and these people did not identify as slaves.
Yeah, they were enslaved.
So if you're in Canada and listening to this, there's some things to think about. And one more thing about Canada, sorry everyone, but this has sort of been my personal frustration in this week in particular, people being like, oh, at least we're not the States. That was about our African Canadians, and we need to be better there, but we are outrageously horrible to Indigenous people. It's absolutely horrific that Indigenous people in Canada, for example, don't even have clean water, drinking water, in many of their communities. So here are some things that are problems for the 8 key issues for Indigenous people in Canada.
Yeah.
Poor health. As I said, that there's respiratory problems because of the areas where the reservations are. They don't have clean drinking water. Lower levels of education because we don't engage in providing for their schools. Inadequate housing and crowded living conditions because there are many multi-occupancy homes in their reservations, and we do not provide enough space. They are given space by the government, but they are given space by the government, and I mean like this little dot.
Emma's making like a tiny little circle with her fingers.
And we are Canada, one of the biggest countries in the world.
With so much
have a bit more space, right? Lower income levels, higher rates of unemployment, higher levels of incarceration, higher death rates among children and youth due to unintentional injuries. Unintentional injuries. So
what might that mean?
Early deaths from drowning and other causes. According to Health Canada statistics, Indigenous children are 3 or 4 times more likely to die from unintentional injury than non-Aboriginal children of the same age.
But I'm not sure why that is.
I'm not sure why that is either, actually. That's all that says here.
Yeah, well, look.
Which might be in where they are, in how it's protected, in how
the safety of the land,
the safety of it, in the way their health is treated, in the way that there is more violence in those communities because of the systemic oppression.
Yeah.
There's a lot more alcoholism in the communities.
I was about to say in terms of substance misuse, because that is fed into communities. Yeah. Is it correct, Emma, as well, that the missing women, that's in Canada?
So there are incredibly high rates of missing and murdered Indigenous women. And this is something where our current Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, he campaigned the first time he won, saying he's going to start an inquiry into that. And I feel like he did in his first month, he made a show of creating a committee but I don't know any updates. I do know that I've been seeing posts today saying, but what about the missing Indigenous women in Canada? And also, Justin Trudeau, 1,000 times better than Trump, but that's not something we want to compare to. He is someone who, in the last year, photos have surfaced of him in blackface and at parties from his 20s, but still, like, you're a prime minister.
Yeah.
You need to be squeaky clean.
So I remember learning, this is an interesting way of learning, but it shows how you can use your platform and your artistic platform. I started learning more about the Indigenous communities in Canada, particularly Native women, through burlesque.
Oh, really?
Through burlesque. And that is through a very good friend, Ruby Three Wise Jones, who is Canadian, and started having discussions with me and introduced me to some burlesque groups or a burlesque group who are Native Indigenous women of Canada.
Oh, incredible.
But their stories their acts are about missing women and about the plight of Aboriginal women. Is Aboriginal the correct word? Is Indigenous. So I've just said Aboriginal because I've just read this word here, but Indigenous is the word.
And if you were to, or First Nations is also correct.
First Nations,
and if you were to know the specific tribe, you would say that.
I mean, this fact sheet is from 2010, so I don't think it's going to help, actually. I just wanted to get some statistics.
We can share on our social media.
Absolutely. I mean, it says here between 1980 and 2012, 1,200 missing and murdered Indigenous women.
Yeah.
However, they think that actually it's over 4,000.
Yeah.
So, because, of course, the Indigenous communities can tell you themselves how many people have gone missing.
Yeah.
So, 4,000 of their women disappearing.
Yeah. And the final thing on my list as well is higher rates of suicide.
Yeah.
Obviously.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And, of course, this goes across the world as well. Like, actually, no, Emma, what was that documentary that we watched?
Oh, yes. If you are interested in, and you should be, in learning more about, and you're in Canada or anywhere and want to learn a little bit more about some of the issues to do with Indigenous people and actually a concept of environmental racism, which is an interesting thing to look at the legacy of racism, Ellen Page, the gorgeous, beautiful Ellen Page, the love of our lives.
Fell in love with her very young.
Ingrid heard that.
It's okay, I'll take her.
Yeah,
I'll take her.
For Jess. Has made an amazing documentary called There's Something in the Water, addressing the racism in her home province.
Which again goes back to provisions for Indigenous communities, because the white people take all the good stuff.
Yeah, it's great. It's on Netflix, so do watch it.
There's so much about all like water systems across the world. This happened with communities that I worked in Thailand, with tribal communities in North Thailand. Water being diverted from the communities to just feed into rich white people's villages. Yeah,
and white people are everywhere taking all the resource.
Yes.
So what can you do?
What can you do? Listeners, thank you for being with us. And I just, on reflection again, if any BIPOC listeners did stick through this, I just want to say, like, also, you didn't need to listen to us talking about our education and learning. Because if I listened to somebody talking about, I don't know. Well, no, I don't know. It's interesting. If somebody,
it's hard to know.
It's interesting to hear if somebody's talking about, oh, I'm just learning what gay means or something. But just, this is for,
This episode is for white people to learn more and to address their own problems. We're not doing this so that you can tell us well done. Basically, we're not expecting you to have listened.
The education needs to happen.
Yeah.
So, we just wanted to finish off, lovely listeners, with what can you do? Some of our suggestions. If you have any more ideas, as always, get in touch at Fluff Creatives on our Instagram or Twitter, or email at fluffinquiries@gmail.com. This is some things that we've just put together here. Emma, do you want to kick us off?
Yeah, sure. So I have a list of actions of things you can actively do apart from learning, which we should all be doing. You need to learn. So listen to this. Let's find other podcasts as well. You can support Black artists and Black business by buying things from them, by buying their work, by watching their shows. Even in lockdown, there's access to all of those sorts of things.
Yeah, and I was reading yesterday about the difference in number of followers, of course, clearly, between if you look at, even like Emma and I follow all the health and well-being artists in the world.
Yes.
But if you look at the difference between the white artists, the number of followings, and then the Black artists who are posting similar great things around content of mental health and such like this, but it is white dominated.
Yeah.
So, and as we know, if you are following anything on Instagram, we're getting the suggestions of people to follow.
Yeah.
So yeah, just keep up.
Yeah, follow them, support them. Find your local charities and donate. If you can't donate, maybe you can volunteer, read books, or listen to relevant podcasts.
And Emma, I went on Spotify this morning, and there is a whole section like where they've normally got updated music. They've got things to listen to for Black Lives Matter, like playlists, podcasts.
Well done, Spotify.
Yeah.
I didn't see that on my Apple, so that's good to know.
Yeah.
But yeah, even the why I'm no longer talking to white people about race has been turned into a podcast as well.
Right.
From 2018, but it's still there, so you can find that for example. Speak to your white friends and family. So this is, I feel like, where Jess and I are at now. We're like, oh, we've never had this conversation. We're now actively engaging those conversations. So start conversations and talk about how people feel about it.
Yeah. And also, if like fills me with a bit of nerves talking to some specific people I have in mind.
Yeah.
But we can't, and again, I can't be ashamed of them privately, secretly to my friends. Like, have that discussion.
Yeah. But that's not just about when they say something. Like, it's about starting the conversation.
Exactly. Emma, as you said, you just sent a message round.
I just composed a message that said, hey, particularly to anyone who posted a black square who was not someone that ever had conversations around any social justice issue before. And I just sent them a message saying, hey, I noticed you posted black square. I'd be interested in talking to you about this further so we can share learning.
Exactly.
And I've had some really interesting responses, which is cool, from people who I've never spoken to us about.
Yeah.
Address your own privilege. That's what we're doing now. Hopefully that's what you can do as well. Share your platform, if you have one, with Black ethnic people of color. Mm-hmm. Please so we're going to be doing that with Fluff. We want to make sure that as we have a following, we can be sharing their information. But if you're an artist or you have any way where people listen to you, share it with them. And that comes to the next one, is listen and amplify. So don't necessarily speak on behalf, but share what they have said and make sure that you are amplifying the voices.
And I think, Emma, like on reflection, like we spoke to some Black artist friends earlier, and we did, because we wanted to release some work this Friday, but I think taking in mind, like we said, like it's a quick turnaround, but also people are also really upset right now, really stretched, really at capacity. So again, like I think we had this, like this is what we're going to do, but also allowing space, allowing time, and that BIPOC people many are very tired now and exhausted and stretched. So supporting them as best you can with engaging with your platform. So we were like, here's how we can help you engage with ease, like not feel you have to do a whole new lots of work. Like, have you got some sound recordings of you singing that we can just share? How can we make it so it's not, again, extra work amongst the mental strain and stretch of this
and again,
difficult time?
Not just about your race. Like, we just want to support you and amplify your work and your art. Yeah,
exactly. And then I just am feeding off here again. If a BIPOC person pulls you up on your activism or pulls you up on anything that you say, listen, I'm sure I will be pulled up on something, and it's about becoming and learning to be better with your words. If you do say something, I'm putting in, because this is a word in quotation marks, sloppy, like not rightly phrased, not using the correct language, using outdated terms, or just not framing things in the most helpful way positive. If somebody can say, if you frame it this way, it's going to have so much more impact, or I just want to talk to you about this viewpoint, it's not quite right, or it's not right at all. Like, just listen and we learn. And
Yeah.
so don't take offense to it, like rise from it and learn from it and grow, because we need to keep growing and growing. And so there always will be mistakes made.
Yeah, and recognize that this is something you don't know. You are not the expert in. So if someone says, actually, we'd rather you do it this way, or it would be more helpful to do it this way. It's not you being wrong. It's not about you having, it's not about take away your ego from it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, taking away your ego, it's really good. But it's about you being part of something. We're all part of this now. And so we're going to do our best and we're going to work hard. And on that, working hard, if you are tired, as I said, Emma and I mentioned that our brains are frazzled, our brains are fried after just 2 days of really thinking about this. The most that we've probably ever been like, oh, shit, we need to do stuff now. Like, we can't just do our bits and bobs throughout, I'd say, I don't know, the week. Like, every podcast we try and platform something.
Yeah.
But if you are tired, recharge. And then keep going, keep coming back to it. Like, we should be exhausted. And there are people in life, some people will sit back and watch the world go by.
Yeah.
Other people are going to, like, because, you know what, BIPOC people are always active and they will always be active. So we equally have to be always active. Again, that's the realization. It's like, we should all be tired.
Yeah, exactly. And that comes to your next point perfectly.
Which is, do not put the onus on Black people to change the system, to change society's structures, to change any structures. Again, like, why do you need to identify as that minority to do the work? Why can't we all just do the work, maybe get it done quicker, but spread out the load? And it shouldn't just be coming from BIPOC people.
Yeah.
We should all equally care that we live in a racist world.
In the same with educating, do not ask your Black, Indigenous, people of color friends to educate you on racism. The resources are there.
It's all there.
It's not their responsibility to help you understand your white privilege. It's on you to start that process.
All the literature is there, all the audio is there, all the ability to have conversations with your white friends is there.
Because I've seen a lot of posts in the last couple of days saying, email me what you want changed, or email me how you want to do things or continue, or institutions saying, let us know what needs to be changed. It's quite obvious what needs to be changed. Do not put that on the Black people to have to relive their trauma by telling you what's wrong.
Yeah, exactly. We know.
Yeah.
It's not just about taking a moment to think and have a move forward. It's action.
Yeah, exactly.
Action. Podcast listeners, do get in contact. You know our things. I've said them earlier. We're on 1 hour, 19 minutes, 36 seconds.
An important one.
Yeah. Thank you for being with us today. We're here to have the conversations. And let's keep going, hey? Fluff solidarity is what we're about. And that extends to all BIPOC people.
Yeah. Sending love and care to everyone.
And hugs. If you want to hug.
Thanks for listening, and don't forget to rate and subscribe.
We're excited to welcome you into our Fluff family and bring you some gorgeous sparkles every Friday.
Oh,